Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed Daled continues a discussion of medical treatment for a child who has just undergone a bris milah. We begin the daf with discussing things which you can do on Yom Tov which you couldn't do on Shabbos. Then we'll discuss some halachos of Yom Tov in general. Then we'll discuss a number of cures that Abai heard from his adoptive mother. Then we get a Mishnah, and that begins a discussion about using hot water to bathe the child on Shabbos, and that'll be the entire second half of the daf. So first of all, we start with the Brisa. The Brisa lists two things which you can do on Yom Tov to treat a bris milah, but you cannot do on Shabbos, and they are: you're allowed to grind up a spice called kamoin, which is used to make a powder, and you're allowed to beat oil and wine together. So the Gemara asks, what could be the reason that this is permitted on Yom Tov and not on Shabbos? So the simple understanding would be because you could use it for something on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook. So if you're going to grind up spice, so I understand why you're allowed to use that. Why you're allowed to do that on Yom Tov. You could actually use it for food. Anything which you're allowed to do for food, you're allowed to do on Yom Tov in any circumstance. But the Gemara says, but then why wouldn't you be allowed to do it on Shabbos? Beating wine and oil together is not a problem on Shabbos because you're allowed to beat wine and oil together in order to make a solution to treat a sick person, even on Shabbos. How do we know that? So first of all, let's remember that this brisa doesn't have a name, which means that the author is Rabbi Meir. And we're going to show that Rabbi Meir holds that you're allowed to beat wine and oil together in order to treat a sick individual. Show that with another brisa that quotes a machlokas, are you allowed to beat wine and oil together or not? According to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, you're not allowed to. According to the Tanna Kama, you're not allowed to there, but Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar quotes Rabbi Meir, who says you are allowed to. So you see, that's our question. You're allowed to beat wine and oil together for someone sick, therefore I should be allowed to do it on Shabbos for a bris milah, especially because I could use it for somebody who is sick already. So the Gemara now quotes an incident here. The Gemara says that Rabbi Meir was once not feeling well. He had a gastrointestinal disorder, and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar was there, and he wanted to make him a mixture of oil and wine together, and he said no. So he said, what do you mean? You hold it, it's permitted. You're going to cancel your own opinion while you're still alive. So he said, you're right, I hold that way, and I'll pass on that way for anybody else, but I myself have a rule that I never violate what other chaverim of mine say. What my acquaintances tell me, they argue with me, and therefore I always adopt their approach. But you see, he did hold that the halacha was that it was permitted. So that's back to our question. If he held it, it's permitted, so then why couldn't you do it for a bris milah on Shabbos? So the Gemara says it's only permitted in a situation where you're not going to whip them together. You'll just combine them, but you're not going to whip them. So the Gemara says, so then for this bris milah, so let's combine it without whipping. So the Gemara says, yeah, that's what you're allowed to do. You're allowed to do that. That's what we even said in our Mishnah. You're allowed to put on the wine and the oil separately, and then they mix together while on the skin. Okay, now the Gemara quotes a brisa about general halachos of Yom Tov, and it says two halachos. You are not allowed to sift mustard seed. You're not actually sifting much out, so it should be permitted, but midrabanan you're not allowed to. And you're not allowed to sweeten mustard seed by putting them in coals. The heat sweetens them, the roasting sweetens them. So Gemara says, Abai says to Rav Yosef, why is this different? I have a question on both of these. First of all, you're allowed to strain an egg in a mustard sifter. So if you're allowed to strain an egg, because you're not straining anything, how come you're not allowed to sift the mustard seed? So the Gemara answers, because you're straining the egg, what goes in the strainer comes out of the strainer. You don't look like you're actually straining anything out. Rashi explains that it increases the appearance, it improves the appearance, but you're not actually straining anything. And however, when you're sifting mustard, you are holding some husks back, and therefore you're not allowed to do that. Now the Gemara says, you also said that you aren't allowed to sweeten it with a coal, but we learned in a different brisa you are allowed to sweeten it with a coal. The Gemara explains it's two types of coals. If the coal is hot metal, you don't have to be afraid that by sweetening it in mustard you're going to extinguish the coal and make actual charcoal. You're not going to do that if it's metal. However, if it's wood, you might do that, and making charcoal is an isser, and therefore we don't let you do that. Now the Gemara asks, but how come you're allowed to roast meat over an open fire, over coals on Yom Tov? Why are you allowed to do that? So the Gemara answers, there's a difference. Meat, you cannot prepare before Yom Tov and have it still be high quality. It decreases. Therefore, we don't make chumras on you. However, mustard, you could do it before Yom Tov, therefore there's no reason to do it on Yom Tov. Now the Gemara says, Abai asked Yosef, what about making cheese? So he said, you're not allowed to make cheese on Yom Tov, you should do it before. He said, but why not? The whole problem with making cheese is that it's like kneading. You're turning a powder or a liquid into a solid. And kneading you're allowed to do on Yom Tov. So he said, that's the same answer. Kneading you can't do before Yom Tov. It's got to be done on Yom Tov, otherwise it won't be high quality food. Cheese you can make before Yom Tov. As a matter of fact, cheese improves with age. So Gemara says, what do you mean? We have a quote from Nahardar where they said that cheese is good on the day it's made. It seems to indicate that it has to be done that day. So Gemara answers, cheese is good even on the day it's made. It's better when it's done the day before. Therefore, you can do cheese before Yom Tov, but you can't make you can't knead the dough before Yom Tov. Okay, now the Gemara begins with a list of cures that Abai learned from his mother. Abai, of course, was an orphan, so whenever he said his mother, he was referring to his adoptive mother. And the first thing is concerning making the cap to cover the head of the organ after the bris to prevent the skin and the membrane from sliding back on. And she said you have to be careful with the seam and the hem of the edge of the cloth. It should not touch the wound, because what could happen is that the threads on the edge of the cloth could get stuck in the wound, and when you try to peel it off, those threads can cause an injury to the limb. Therefore, you want to make sure that you do not do that. So there are three things here. First of all, she said that you should fold up the edge so that you don't have the edge near the wound. She actually made a cap which she put under that cloth, and she folded the cloth inward so that it wasn't near the wound. Abai himself said if you don't have a cloth to cover it with, you should get some kind of a rag and you should fold it and keep the hem and keep the edge away from the wound. Okay, now another thing that Abai learned from his mother, adoptive, is that a child that has a covering of skin over his anal orifice so that he cannot relieve himself, it's covered, so you want to pierce the skin, you don't know exactly where the right spot is. So what you should do is you should smear the area with oil and put it in the sun for a while, and when it becomes translucent in one spot, that's the right spot, that's where the skin is covering the orifice, and you should take a stalk of barley and pierce it. Don't use metal to pierce it, you should pierce it in a cross shape. Don't use metal because that can cause it to get infected and inflamed. Okay, now what happens if a child doesn't nurse properly? So Abai's mother said his lips are too cold. You should put some coals on a board and hold his face near it, not too close to hurt him, but enough to warm his lips, and then he'll be able to nurse. She also told Abai that if you have a child who's not breathing, you should fan him with a fan, and then he'll start breathing. If he's not breathing properly, he's getting air, but not enough air, so you should rub his mother's placenta with him. Now, next is that if the child's not thriving, he's not growing properly, he's too small, you should take the placenta, which was shaped wide on one end and narrow on the other end, you should rub it from the narrow side down to the wide side. And if he's too inflated, if he's swollen, you should rub it the other way from the wide side down to the narrow side. Okay, if you have a child whose skin is reddened, that means that his blood is not properly absorbed in the flesh, it is stuck between the skin and the flesh, you should wait until it absorbs and only then do the bris milah, otherwise he could bleed too much. If you have a child whose skin is too yellow, that means he did not form enough blood yet, you should wait until he forms blood. And then afterwards you should do the milah, otherwise he could be too ill and he might come to a dangerous situation because of the bris. Now the Gemara has two stories here. Abraisa, Rabbi Nassan, traveled to two places. Once he traveled to islands, and another time he traveled to a place called Kaputka. In the islands he met a woman who said that two of her children died shortly after the bris milah, and she brought him the third son, and he looked at him and he saw that he was red. So he said, you have to wait until the blood is absorbed. She waited and the child lived, and she named him Nasan HaBavli because he had come from Bavel after him. In the second story, in Kaputka, the child was jaundiced, and he said, wait until the blood forms, and she waited, and again he had the bris and he survived, and again she named him Nasan HaBavli after him. Okay, now we get to the Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses washing the child. So apparently it's very important medically to wash the child before the bris milah, after the bris milah, and on the third day of the bris milah. And the question is, are you allowed to do that using hot water? And you're allowed to put the child in the bath itself. So you would only be allowed to actually put the child in the bath if it is considered to be very medically important. If it's not that important, then you would just pour water on him, and you could pour water with your hands. That would be the most mutter way to do things. So we have here The Mishnah will discuss washing the baby on the day of the bris, washing the baby on the third day of the bris. We'll have two opinions. So first of all, the Mishnah brings the first opinion, which is the Tanna Kama. You're allowed to wash the baby in the bath in hot water on the day of the bris, before and after the bris. And then it says, and this is a strange line, it says, and you should pour the water on with your hand. And then it says, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, you're even allowed to put the baby in the bath on the third day from the bris. Now, we don't know what that middle line is for exactly, and the Mishnah continues here, and the Mishnah says, what happens if you have somebody who's a suffix? Suffix means you do not know if he was born in his 8th month of gestation or not. It could be the 7th or the 9th. Now, in the days of Chazal, it was clear that any child who was born in the 7th or the 9th month survived. Any child who was born in the 8th month had no chance of survival. Therefore, you could not do a bris for him on Shabbos. It would be Chol Shabbos for somebody who's not going to survive. We did not do that. So if he was a suffix, you don't know if it was the 8th month or not, we don't do the bris on Shabbos. Androgynous, that's from the word androgynous, meaning hermaphrodite, somebody who has both male and female organs. So he's also a suffix. He's not clear whether or not he or she requires a bris, and therefore we do not do a bris on Shabbos. So now the Gemara begins, and right away we want to try to figure out what this line here means, that we can pour the water with the hand. Because first of all, we started off saying that you're allowed to put the baby, you're allowed to do marchitzin, you're allowed to wash the baby. That sounds like he's allowed to go in the bath. Then you tell me, you pour with your hand, and then you tell me, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says you're even allowed to stick him in the bath on the third day. So what's going on? So Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Bar Avua understand that the second line is just explaining the first line. When we said you're allowed to bathe the baby, we didn't mean in the bath. We meant all along only by pouring water on him with your hand. So that means that according to the Tanna Kama, you're only allowed to pour with your hand the first day, second day, third day, whenever it is. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, you're allowed to put him in the bath first day, second day, third day, whatever time you want. That is Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Bar Avua's opinion, and we would paskin down like the Tanna Kama, you'll only be allowed to pour water all 3 days. Now Rava says differently. No, the middle line is referring to the third day. So that means as follows. First we say you're allowed to put the baby in the bath. That everybody agrees to. Then we say you pour with the hand. That's referring to the third day. And on that, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah argues, and he says, no, on the third day you're allowed to put in the bath also. Therefore, according to Rava, what would come out? That everybody agrees you're allowed to put the baby in the bath the first day and the second day. The third day is a machlekes. And on that day, we would say that you cannot put the baby in the bath. We would pass along to Tanna Kama. You would have to pour water on him by hand. So the difference between Rava and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Bar Avua is: are you allowed to put the baby in the bath on the first day and the second day? According to Rava, the Tanna Kama would say no, and according to Rava, the Tanna Kama would say yes, and according to the other ones, the Tanna Kama would say no. So Gemara says we learned a brisa which is very explicitly like Rava. And the Brisa says as follows, that it spells it out. Clearly it says you're allowed to wash the baby the first day before the bris, after the bris, in the normal way, in the bath. On the third day, you should pour water on him. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says you can stick him in the bath, even on the third day. Of course, obviously this means that the third day is on Shabbos. And now we say that even though we cannot prove that, and this line is in the Mishnah also, even though we can't prove that on the third day you're allowed to do special treatments, because the third day is very important medically, there is an indication from the Torah that the third day is important, because when Shimon and Levi attacked the city of Shechem, it was on the third day, and it says that the people of Shechem had performed the bris milah 2 days earlier, and therefore they were in a lot of pain, and they were very easily defeated. So then we finish up here. The Brisa says that when you pour the water, you don't pour it with a cup or a plate, you pour it straight out of your hand. So it's explicitly like Rava. So now, that last line about pouring with the hand, that's of course the Tanna Kama's opinion, because according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, you're allowed to put the baby in the bath directly at any time, even on the third day. So now the Gemara asks, why did we say that proof from Shechem is not a clear proof? Sounds pretty clear to me. Sounds like they were obviously very weak right after the third day, on the third day. So Gemara says no, because that was only adults. Adults don't heal as quickly as children. Children heal faster, and it could be that there wouldn't be a problem on the third day for a child. And now the Gemara brings an incident. Somebody came and he asked Rava, what should I do with my child? Am I allowed to put him in the bath on the first day directly, or should I pour water on him? And Rava said, in accordance with his own opinion, that Tanna Kama would say that you're allowed to stick him in the bath on the first day, and therefore he said you're allowed to stick him in the bath. Now, what actually happened then was that Rava became weak, and he got sick. He was weak, and he got sick, and he was afraid that the reason for his illness was because he had told somebody to follow his own psak, his own halacha, and he said, "Oh, why did I have to get involved with the machlokes with those two Talmidei Chachamim, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Bar Avua? I should have never gotten involved." So somebody said to him, "What do you mean? But we have a brisa that says you're explicitly correct. It says just like you." He says, "Yeah, you have a brisa like me, but the Mishnah seems to say like them, because if you look carefully in the wording of the Mishnah, it fits better according to them. According to my understanding of the Mishnah, the Tanna Kama said that you're allowed to put the baby in the bath on the first day, and he only said on the third day you have to pour the water. So if Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was arguing that, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's wording should have been, even he should say, no, even on the third day you're allowed to put the baby in the bath. The fact that he didn't say even, the fact that he just said you're allowed to put the baby in the bath would seem to indicate that the Tanna Kama never holds you're allowed to put the baby in the bath, and he always holds you have to pour water on him, which is like the opinion of Rav Yehuda and Rabbi Bar Avuha. Okay, now what's actually the halacha over here? So the Gemara says when Rav Dimi came, he said that the halacha is like Rav Elazar ben Azariah actually. Now in Eretz Yisrael they were wondering, you're allowed to wash the baby. What does it mean? You're allowed to wash the entire body of the baby or the area of the bris milah itself. So one of the Rabbanim came and said to one of the Rabbanan came and his name was Rabbi Yaakov, and he said it makes sense to say that you're allowed to wash the whole body. Why? Because if you're talking about just washing the milah, well, I don't need special halachas for a bris. The child has a wound. The halacha always is that you're allowed to wash a wound with hot water. That we know. Rav said that explicitly. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef asks, well, hold on a second. Here we're talking about hot water that was heated up on Shabbos. Obviously heated up in a permitted way, but it was heated up on Shabbos. That's nothing to do with water that was heated before Shabbos. You're only allowed to use, for most wounds, you're only allowed to use water that was heated before Shabbos. Water that was heated on Shabbos is forbidden. There's a gzeira midirabanan against washing with water heated on Shabbos. It's an extra strong gzeira. There's one before Shabbos also, but there's an extra one if it was heated on Shabbos. So why would you think that just because you're allowed to use water that was heated before Shabbos for every wound, that you're allowed to use for a baby water that was heated on Shabbos? This is a special halacha here that you're allowed to do it on Shabbos. So Gemara says, Rav Dimi said, who said we're referring here to water that was heated on Shabbos? Maybe we're talking about water that was heated before Shabbos. So Abaye said, I was about to enter, and Rav Yosef answered before me. He said, what do you mean? We're talking about a case of a danger to the child's life. You think we're going to start saying, no, only water on Shabbos, only water heated before Shabbos, not water heated on Shabbos? Of course you're allowed to use water heated on Shabbos. Okay, now the Gemara actually says that Rav instead of the name of Rabbi Avo in the name of Rabbi Elazar, and some say Rabbi Avo in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, the halacha is like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. You're allowed to eat hot water heated on Shabbos, before Shabbos, whatever you want. You're allowed to wash the entire body, you're allowed to wash the place of the milah, you're allowed to wash everything, because it's all a situation of sakana, and therefore you're allowed to do all these things. And now the Gemara goes deeper into the statement which we just quoted from Rav, that you're allowed to put hot water on a wound on Shabbos. It also says you're allowed to put oil on the wound on Shabbos. Shmuel says you're not allowed to put it on Shabbos because it appears like you are putting on a medical treatment. A medical treatment is forbidden on Shabbos for a simple injury. And therefore what you should do is you should put it on the skin near the wound and it'll flow into the wound by itself. That you're allowed to do, but to put it directly onto the wound is forbidden. So Gemara tries three proofs here. Gemara says, first of all, we have a brisa that says you're not allowed to put oil and hot water on a pad to apply to the wound on Shabbos. That would seem to indicate, like Shmuel, you're not allowed to put it directly on Shabbos. And Gemara says, no, there is, because it's a pad and it's a problem of squeezing. We don't want it to squeeze out. The next proof is very similar. If you have a cloth on the wound, you are not allowed to put oil and water on that cloth. Again, the Gemara says it's not a proof. There, the issue is again squeezing. We don't want you to squeeze the liquids out of the cloth. So now we have a brisa that is definitive. It says you're not allowed to put water and oil on a wound on Shabbos. You should put it near it and let it flow into the wound on its own, clearly like Shmuel. Okay, brisa. Brisa says you're allowed to put on a wound. You're allowed to place a dry pad or sponge or a plant called gemi, which is also soft. But you should not put strips of dry cloth. So here we said you're not allowed to put strips of dry cloth, but earlier we had said that you are allowed to put cloth on the wound, so which is it? Contradiction. The Gemara says you're only allowed to put old cloth, you're not allowed to put new cloth. Old cloth just protects the wound. New cloth actually has a healing effect, and Abaye points that out, and that is therefore the reason you're not allowed to place it on the...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.